As I mentioned, we will be recording this session and it will be posted on our peer website, which is hi.peer, hi-peer.org. I'm going to put the link in the chat to the website now so you can check it out later. As I mentioned, if you're not comfortable being on the recording, you can turn off your video and or rename yourself. I'll give you guys a few minutes to do so now as I go through my speech. Our center is housed within the Pacific Inclusive Education Research and Resources Center, or PEER for short. PEER is managed by faculty and staff at the Center on Disability Studies, located on the University of Hawaii at Manoa campus. The overarching goal of our center is to nurture untapped talents through inclusive practices. To reach this goal, we host monthly speaker series as well as an in-person symposium that focuses on building awareness and neurodiversity and choice exceptionality. Our speaker series and symposiums are made possible through the funding from the U.S. Department of Education Jacob K. Javits Gifted and Talented Education Program grant. Each month of our speaker series, we focus on a different topic and perspective from well-known speakers in the areas of inclusion, neurodiversity, and education. I'm happy to introduce today's speakers. Today we have Jody Bill, Rocky Knox, and Joanna Philippa. Our session today contains a panel of faculty and researchers who have a disability, and we want to highlight their experiences working for the college and with students. We are hopeful that this session will bring awareness to others about college faculty and staff who are neurodiverse, highlighting their career journeys and navigation through the college system. We hope that this session is inspiring and encouraging to other faculty, staff, and students who are either already attending college or planning to attend college. So without further ado, please welcome our panelists. And to begin, I want to start by asking our panelists to one by one introduce themselves, maybe tell us a little bit about what you do for the college or your research. Yeah. Can start us off.
Okay. Hi, I'm Rocky Knox. I am from Waimanalo, Hawaii. I went to UH Manoa for my master's program and then came back after my doctorate as an assistant professor in special education, the Department of Special Ed. My focus is on executive function, ADHD, inclusion. And those are the kind of main areas that I focus on. And that's a good introduction.
Aloha, my name is Joanna Filipoff. I am an associate specialist in the School of Teacher Education and in the College of Education. And my research is on STEM education, place-based education, and really more specifically, participatory science education. And I have ADHD.
Hi, I'm Jody Bill. I also work for the Department of Special Education. I mostly teach in the elementary and special education dual cert program. I'm a field supervisor, instructor, cohort coordinator, mostly in literacy and co-teaching. And I was just diagnosed with ADHD a couple months ago.
Thank you, everyone, for introducing yourselves. So to start off, the first question I want to ask is, how has your disability influenced your teaching, research, or interactions with students and colleagues?
I think I should also round out the trio by saying I also was diagnosed with ADHD, but many years ago, I also was diagnosed with depression as a teenager. So there are a lot of kind of various things floating in the ether, but just to give people context of the issues that kind of come up for me with teaching and as a faculty member. And I think a lot of that is on the positive side, actually. I think that having ADHD, some of the positive aspects of that are a strong sense of justice, empathy, relationship building. And so I think as a teacher, those are kind of the things you need, right? As a strong faculty member. So in my overall sense, it's been fairly positive, although, the flip side of that is that it always feels like a slog because with ADHD, there's a sense of dysregulation that is kind of always about you. So, you're never quite on task. You always feel like you are not having things done in time. Everything kind of feels like it's like you're racing to finish things that you know, haven't finished yet. So it'd be like my first thoughts on that. Joe?
Um, I think when we're talking about how the disability has influenced my teaching, I think I bring it to the forefront in some of my teaching because I want my students to know that I have ADHD and also talk very explicitly about how that might show up in my interactions with them. Um, because it does affect both how I teach and it affects things that affect them. Like just a teaching story would be I share agendas at the beginning of each class about like, this is what we're going to do today. And I have times associated with those agendas. And I have pretty severe time blindness. And it is kind of a surprise when different activities might end and playing around with timing. But I'm pretty explicit with that with my students, and it's not something that I'm trying to hide. It's just that I'm not good at projecting out time. But I am good at modifying schedules and being flexible and thinking on my feet. So that is also things that are associated with ADHD. The other part of the question was like I don't research anything to do with my neurodiversity. But I am more interested in maybe pursuing that in the future, like learning more about yourself. That sounds kind of fun. But I think my interactions with students and colleagues are quite different around this. I'm extremely open with my students, but more so with upper undergraduates than lower undergraduates. And that the lower undergraduates, it's more, I'm not hiding anything, but it's more like context specific. And then with colleagues, sometimes it's reading the room and seeing if this is something that, I mean, it's a lot of times there's no point in sharing specifics about things about, um, when people are brought together for meetings or panels or whatnot, like there's no point. But other times it's, oh, this is a supportive environment, and other times you kind of get the more unwritten that maybe it's not supportive. And so, yeah, then you are careful about what you share in different environments.
For me, being recently diagnosed, in a more informal research sense, I feel like I'm heavy in the driver's seat of like researching everything and listening to everything about ADHD and neurodiversity that I can, which is making a lot of sense in retrospect because I've been a teacher for many years, in the elementary setting and worked with kids with ADHD and have students now who have an ADHD diagnosis. And while I'm finding tools for my own teacher toolbox, I'm finding that I'm better able to support my students. And um, I'm able to relate and connect to them a little bit more because I can follow them and I can understand them. Um, but similar to what Joanna said about just finding strategies that work for me as an instructor in teaching classes, making an agenda for classes and mapping out times to keep myself on track. Yeah, I relied heavily on coping strategies, I realize, over the years. But just recently, I through my experience and what I'm discovering, I feel I have a lot to offer and support for my own students.
Yeah, it's very meta, isn't it? In a sense, because it's, when you are kind of your job is about teaching and learning, and you are trying to teach, how to teach and what learning is, and you are constantly trying to think about your own learning and kind of how that affects and be explicit with other people about your learning and how it affects their learning.
Mhm.
So in some ways, it opens up a lot of really interesting conversations.
I also think the masking can vary very widely based on the situation. And I think I was diagnosed longer ago than Jody, but much more recently compared to Rocky. So I'm kind of in the middle, like about 3 years ago ish. And I mask constantly. Like it's constant, and it's nice to let those barriers down sometimes in different situations, but it's also protective, and it allows me to move between spaces. So I think it can be it's not it's not always a bad thing. It's just I also have like 40 years of living that I've like developed these type of masking strategies. So finding
Joanna,
out when to drop them is,
yeah.
yeah.
Can you give me an example of what would be masking for you?
I fidget constantly, and
Ah,
sometimes I fidget less.
okay, got you.
And I have fidget toys around me, like on Zoom that you can't
Mhm.
see. So I can fidget without anyone knowing. And then in person, I used to like fidget without even knowing it, but I would fidget more overtly versus less. I try to blurt out stuff less when I'm in different situations and think more before I speak. However, one of the reasons I blurt out stuff is because I'm not good at holding multiple strands of thought in my head. And the reason I blurt out things is because I'm like, I have something to say. I want to say it right now. So holding back means that I sometimes miss saying stuff, or I have to write it down and then come back to it, which means that before I say it, I might not be paying attention
Mhm.
because I'm trying to track where would be an appropriate time to share things.
I asked because I was thinking to myself that it's been so long since I've been diagnosed, and how much of the behaviors that are actually masking are things that I just kind of take for granted or not. Because I think when I was diagnosed, that term wasn't really around. So, I I don't have conscious masking. But if you're talking about it, if you're talking about ADHD or any kind of really disability in a workplace, so like in academia, I think there's like so much masking that has to happen, or there at least there's so much kind of containment, right? Containment of tendencies, because there are very like specific norms, and values that are out there. So you just really have to like be careful on how like you said, reading the room.
Do you guys think masking is something that you should do, or is that something like Rocky more along the lines you like you're saying that it's like the norm, right? The norm of what you're expected to do. So like, is that
I think
something
I
we
think you
should
okay. So this is
break
just
that?
personal opinion.
Yeah.
I think you have to do some of it, like just to exist in the world.
Mhm.
However, it's exhausting. So I think when I am in an environment that when I read the room, that I'm like, oh, I need to act super academic here, and whatever I'm thinking that might be like that set of behaviors or conversation parts. It's just very tiring. And so I will just be tired afterwards. More so than if I'm not monitoring myself, because I think masking to me mostly means monitoring myself, and it's less that I act different. And I think a lot of the behavior is just me, right? So, but it's being more aware of how I am in large groups is tiring.
Well, this kind of brings me to my next question about what misconceptions do you think people have about professionals with disabilities in academia? And I'm going to also put the question in the chat for people.
A hard one. Because I think I don't, at least for, and I don't speak for you, Jody, but Jody and I are in the same department, and our actual field is, focused on disability, um, kids with disabilities. So like the idea of like perceptions of disabilities, or it's something that I think is so entwined with what I do and what I teach, like uh, how do people perceive disability? Do they perceive, quote unquote, invisible disabilities? So I think that like any misconceptions or perceptions are just kind of day to day. I don't know. Hi, Nora. How are you? Um, yeah. So hi, Nora.
Nora is sick today.
One thing. Noodles.
Yeah. So what do you think, Jody?
Um, Definitely what you said about our department in particular being special education. Our department is very accepting, and there seem to be little misconceptions or like stigma attached to any kind of neurodivergence or any kind of diagnosis or disability. But I think that overall in the professional world, there still is some misconception of disability being less capable, or um, people needing to do less or needing a lot of accommodation, or um, yeah, I think there are still misconceptions in general, although you and I might not see that, Rocky, in our department on a regular
Yeah.
basis.
I think actually I should have been probably a little bit more clear. It's that I think that the misconceptions are something I see all the time, I guess is what I mean to say. Because when we're talking about special education or disability, we're talking to schools or teachers or people who, you're to some degree you want to try to convince to like, actually include kids with disabilities, or so talking about the nature of disability in general. I feel like that's all we do to some degree, is kind of try to you know correct, I don't know if that's the right word, misconceptions uh, of disability, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
I think there's so many. I don't even know where to start, quite frankly. I think I have been told, so like my N of one experience, that I don't look like I have ADHD, that I am so productive. So I like, it's just shocking that I can be that way, that I'm like, quote, accomplished. And therefore or it's like everyone's just a little bit like that. And
Everyone's a
I
little
get,
bit ADHD. Yeah.
yeah, which is I think pretty common right now. It's like a trend, right? And I sort of rode that trend in terms of my diagnosis, which I'm actually very thankful for. But now I'm like, well, yeah, I'm meeting the clinical definition of these things. And I think like Rocky and Jody can speak to the power of like self-diagnosis, and there's many reasons that people might not get an official diagnosis, but I don't know, like we all pee, but if you're peeing like 30 times a day, like maybe there's a problem. Um, and I'm pretty like the things that are hardest about ADHD are the things that I am ashamed about and embarrassed about, and that I don't talk about a whole lot, in terms of like just the crippling anxiety and the fun side dose of depression and over analyzing and perfectionism, um, that are not necessarily something you bring up in a regular conversation. So when you're like, oh great, you're like, you got some grants, so you published or you presented, and you're like, yeah, in spite of all these things, and I don't even feel like I can celebrate them because like I was doing them last minute and I'm exhausted, and I have, I mean, we all, I think most people have imposter syndrome, but I think I have it in part because of how I accomplished things.
100%. 100%. Nothing is like actually good enough because we know how it was done at the last minute. It doesn't feel like it was done in the way it should have been done, or it caused so much stress, or it doesn't meet the like, level of perfection that your perfectionism wants it to meet, right? I so relate to that.
Yeah, I relate to that too. I think, Rocky, what you said about the level of perfectionism that you have in your head and not achieving that is where the imposter syndrome continues.
I
Yeah.
think I think also I personally have a very difficult time with transitions and with starting and stopping. But like the starting, that inertia is, I can make it sound funny, but it's not. In actuality, it's so not.
Oh God.
And my child, who just made an appearance because she's homesick today, has ADHD as well, and like I'll share a story because it's indicative of me, but it's cuter if I share it, if it from her perspective. It's homework. And it's, I mean, it's, she can do it. It's not that hard, and she wants to do it. Like I know she wants to do the homework. She does not want to not turn it in, because we've talked about that. Like, just don't turn it in. Definitely wants to do it. And getting her to start it, like, oh my gosh, it has to come from within. Like someone telling you to do it won't ever work. And yet, like getting my internal engine to start chugging, you have to like trick it. Or, I mean, there's that like novelty, or I mean, I think there's a couple of things. It has to be like new, or it has to like be due like in 30 minutes, then things get done. Or it has to be like, one of a deep interest. But there's a lot of things that you have to do every day that are just like life and just part of a job. And those things are really hard to initiate. I mean, medication helps for sure, as does
Yes.
caffeine, but it also doesn't necessarily get you on the right track. It can like put you down deep dives of unrelated things.
Yeah. Task initiation is one of the most painful things, I think, for anyone who struggles with like executive dysfunction. That true sense of torture, where it's very hard, I think, for people who don't experience that to understand the level of paralysis you can feel when you want to start something, or you should start something. You don't actually want to start something, but you should. And the shoulds turn into this like horrible kind of feeling in your head and your belly, and you just sit there feeling it instead of doing it. And you have the conversation like, if you're just to do it, you wouldn't feel this way anymore, right? So just do it. So just do it. But you're still sitting here. Why are you still sitting here? And that can go on for hours, hours and
Days.
hours and days, and yeah, weeks if it's like a task that you have to do. And to until you get to that like that 30 minutes before whatever it is that you have to do, and then you finally, like, that's why we wait to the last minute, right? Because we actually need to have that kind of boundary immediately in front of us to start. But the torture, it's like really hard to explain how incredibly bad it feels. Like, because
And it
there's
can get so bad that it does have these ripple effects.
Yeah.
So then I'm not handing something in perhaps when I should, or I and a lot of that is self perception. I mean, there are those things that I really want to do for myself that I have trouble initiating, and then there are things that, you know, are not just me and that have ripple effects, and it trips up these other, like, almost like chords, like this, like, rejection sensitivity disorder, like, I don't know if it's a disorder, I'm not sure about that, not sure about the terminology, but this, like, I'm not great at modulating my own emotions around other people's. I think it's just emotional regulation overall, which can mean that I overreact emotionally to things. And I'm much better, but it used to be so obvious. Like, I would just get red whenever I was like angry or upset, or all these other types of things, and like wearing your heart on your sleeve when you don't want to because you are so emotionally dysregulated, is its own kind of paralysis. And even though it's not quite that bad anymore because of years of therapy, there's like these spirals that I can like go down in terms of that were might have been tripped up by like having trouble initiating thing, and then someone says something and then I overanalyze that, and then it takes me like 3 days to be productive again because I'm like stuck in this rut. um but yeah, like the worst thing someone can tell me, because they did for many years, is like, just do it, just do the PhD, like, why don't you just do it? Yeah, I should. Let me get on that. I'll just do it.
I think you brought me full circle to the masking question I had, Joe, because that made me think. I was thinking about this in terms of like academia and in terms of kind of our field, and that reactivity and that trying to hide the kind of your own sense of like emotion and reactivity in these environments that do not value like emotional responses, you know, that would definitely be something I would now in my head label as masking. So I appreciate that.
So you guys kind of mentioned something earlier that I kind of want to backtrack towards, and it was Rocky and Jody, since you guys work in the education department in disability,
Special education.
special education, uh, is there ways that you feel that you can see that you're more supported by faculty and staff there versus maybe in other spaces?
Go ahead, Jody.
Um, I mean, I do work with some other faculty in the College of Ed outside of special education, but I think being educators, people are for the most part pretty accepting and accommodating. Like Joanna was discussing earlier, like I'm very familiar with the special education department and I've known people for many years. And with the neurodiversity circle that we've started to have meetings with, I've started to disclose I've been being evaluated for ADHD and being open about that. But it's not something that I've talked about with a lot of people until today. But I think, like Joanna was saying before, you mask with people that you're not quite familiar with, and you feel like you have to, you know, put on a certain kind of like, these are the things I'm going to talk about, and this is how I'm going to act in this faculty. And then when I'm in this faculty, I can um, act a little bit different way, but it's also talking about my own disability is not something for me personally that has come up outside of the circle that we've met with or the team that I work with directly.
Well, I'll talk about it all the time. But primarily because I do exactly what Joe does, in that I've made a conscious decision to talk about it as part of advocacy and teaching because of the field that I'm in. Because I teach special education teachers, I want them to hear people disclosing and talking about disability in positive ways in addition to negative ways. I want them to understand that disability is, you know, not just what people like kind of, the conceptualize as what you see in movies, or, it's not, I think a lot of people, when you're asking about misconceptions about disability, I think a lot of people think about disabilities as either physical disabilities or cognitive developmental disabilities, and there's so many different ways. So I think talking about it and kind of explicating and just modeling like a different, aspect of disability is important for me to do in my job. And I think it's also important for me to do in my like relationships with colleagues. I think that's very important. I do think that special education, like our department is, more open, but to kind of the idea of disability. But in the workplace, when you're talking about the reality of a disability and you have to collaborate with other people, so you are responsible for, meeting deadlines, not just for you, but for other people, right? So like work styles type of thing. Like if I don't explain to people why I'm doing what I'm doing, or, it might be a real problem, because I want people to understand that I'm not doing something just out of like quote unquote laziness, or I'm not, kind of procrastinating because I don't care, things like that. So I'm very, very open and explicit with colleagues and students about, how this impacts me. Um, and I think it's just kind of become almost second nature to refer to it. But I think, even in special ed, like maybe some of our colleagues are like, "Oh, you talking about ADHD again?" But I also kind of don't care in a way, because in a way, it's such a huge, it's not just like a thing in my life. It's it's the neurochemistry I live life with, right? It's like a all-encompassing way that I am in the world. So in some ways, like that's just gonna be how it's gonna be. I think maybe that's a bit of growth over my life. Whereas when I was younger and a younger professional, I might not have felt that, so kind of said that so openly or strongly. But now,
So I still feel less so, but very much less so the last couple of years. But like I am in a tenure track line. And before I was tenured, you're in an extremely vulnerable position. Now, how vulnerable, I think, might vary based on the individual. But I think overall, like the culture of academia puts an enormous amount of stress and pressure on that pinch point. And certainly that was true of how I felt and how I felt I was treated in my department, which has since dissolved, by the way. So my original department that I was hired in does not exist anymore. But my current department, I don't want to not throwing them under the bus. And I felt very vulnerable. And I was not diagnosed when I was first hired. And if I was, I don't know how much I would have shared with my colleagues. With my students, I probably still would have, because there's just just a power dynamic with the students that is very different than my power dynamic with my colleagues, that is different than the power dynamic with my supervisors. And I'm extremely aware of that in terms of how I operate in different realms. I think education overall, I work in science education, and I think education overall is just more accepting of neurodivergence than science is. And there's plenty of neurodivergent people in science. It's just that it's talked about more in education. And I think that is why maybe I almost feel like this like Kuliana, this like responsibility to be more of my authentic self, because in some areas that I operate, I am the only one talking out, and I have this luxury, this like unearned privilege, right, of being who I am, and now having tenure and being able to speak out in ways that I don't feel like was able to before, and in spaces that maybe other people feel more vulnerable. So
I think that's a really excellent point. Just to like really quickly make that point, I made a conscious decision not to go to tenure track. Like I have had opportunities where people have said, let me help you, like let's work towards this. And I have had experiences that just made me think I don't want to be in that situation. Like in a tenure track position, not tenured, but in your tenure track position, and have to juggle all of the things that I have to juggle. So I just wanted to acknowledge, like, I think that power dynamic that you're talking about, Joe, is really important. And that vulnerability is really important. And I very purposely like avoided it. So I didn't have to be in that situation. So I just want to like validate that. I also want to say that it is definitely, we all have unearned privilege, but tenure is an earned privilege, and you earned that. So just put that out there.
but there's other spaces, like just kind of point out the obvious, like we're all white women here who are talking about this, and
100%.
that is, I think there's a reason. There's reasons. There's isms associated with that.
100%. Absolutely.
So are there specific things that
Disability and sorry. What? No, go ahead. Go ahead.
I was
Please.
gonna jump to a different track? So if you have, or
That's
if you
great.
want to,
Let's do
oh,
that.
okay, okay. I was gonna say like
I can easily jump.
I was kind of hoping maybe if there's some specific things that colleges and their staff can do to create more inclusive environments for faculty and staff with disabilities. Do you guys have any suggestions?
Yes, I love to talk about this
Okay,
because
great.
when I first, and so like the background for like the neurodiversity circle that was formed in the College of Education is because when I was diagnosed, I was like, where's the support? Because I am not from the SPED field. I know nothing about what kinds of supports were available or not available. And so I just was like, there's Kakua for the students. I know what kind of supports my students are getting. Where is the faculty staff support? So I started asking around, and like, there's nothing. I mean, there really is nothing. And the tricky thing about accommodations, and again, Rocky and Jody can talk way more about this in terms of like the legal stuff, but it's accommodations are reasonable accommodations to do your job. And my job is like really hard to define, first of all, because like, you're like teaching and researching and all this stuff. So like these individual aspects are easy to define, but the totality can be tricky. And tenure and promotion are based off of like my meeting these like criteria that are set by the university. And so I had these ideas of accommodations and what that might mean, and what something that like I was like, this is, at the time I had applied for tenure and promotion, and I was tenured but not promoted. And I, because of the track that I'm on, and I'm like, to get promoted, I think I need this type of professional development that I had read was like good for women and good for women, neurodiverse women, and parents. Like it's just like those juggling and wearing many hats. But it wasn't cheap, but I thought I was like, I'm gonna like basically like come out to my supervisors with all of this. And I got the, wow, you're like a little ADHD. You don't like have a lot of ADHD. It's like a little bit, like you're doing fine. And I got like, well, this is kind of expensive and we don't give this type of support to other people. So, and I heard that and I went up the chain because I was like, well, and because a lot of the chain was just like, we don't know what to do with this request. And so as it went up into the various chains of academics, you heard no in many different ways. And that was like shocking, quite frankly. I mean, I don't know, very neurodiverse like thing, but like I was on the phone to people, like, I don't like the phone. Yuck. I like, but I actually like called people to try to advocate for myself because I felt like I had to do that at that time because I still felt very vulnerable, but I had tenure. So I was like a little bit less vulnerable, but not promoted. So like in this in-between space that I think was really um, I was trying to move forward and I felt really stuck. And I was clearly, if unintentionally, told by those above me that this was not something I should be spending my time on. And then when I was complaining to someone about this, I did not know Rocky at the time, and they're like, "Oh, there's like this woman in this other department that you should meet." And I think that's, and then we met, and first of all I'm like, it doesn't really work like that just because you have this trait, but there are these similarities, and I think it's so important to find your hui, to find your group, to find your circle. And like even like podcasts and websites that I found and people that I follow, like that's kind of my like internet hui a little bit. But you like in person is way better. And just to understand like this is how to advocate for yourself, and these are some of the things you can say, and this is how it's worked, and this is how it hasn't worked. Like it's so, I don't know, it feels really good even if you're at the same place at the end of it.
And I think it's good for, in multiple ways, right? It's like, this is how it works. This is how, it doesn't work, but also people saying, but why doesn't it work like that? Right? If the conversation like Joe, came to me and told me about, the various things that she was looking for in support. And as an old, grizzled ADHD veteran, I just was like, why would you even think that like anybody would, acknowledge that as like, something that should be helped out as, right? But I say that ruefully, right? Like because it's an indictment of the system, not the person thinking it. But there's also just that kind of jadedness that like, oh, there's no way they do that anyway. But then maybe that's something that I need to rethink, right? And I think since talking to Joe and other people, I'm much more kind of, all right, what are the possibilities? What are the potentials? Institutionally, though, that like I think having more awareness generally of neurodiversity would be a great thing as part of like more professional development. I think that uh, higher ed is aware of the isms to some degree, even if they perpetuate them frequently. But I don't think that they're very aware of ableism. I don't think they're very aware of kind of this neurotypical standard for people. So I think maybe that's one area that could be tackled at the institutional level. I don't know. What do you think?
I agree. I think it would be helpful for there to be more awareness of neurodivergence and also just like in a practical sense, working with colleagues and learning more about their work styles, like what works for them, what doesn't work for them, what are their strengths, what's not helpful for them, and just having open communication about something as simple as work styles or communication styles.
Yeah, and just to also, I think, to talk about it in a way that's not value ridden, that we're not talking about like neurodiversity or neurodivergence in the sense of a dis affliction, right? That we don't always these things can be different and they can be difficult, but they don't have to be bad. So I think that's pretty
Normalize
important.
those conversations for everybody, like because nobody works the same, nobody communicates the same. So that releases a lot of the stigma, I think.
And there are universities out there that are doing it better, that are supporting faculty and staff with disabilities. And I obviously am going to know most about my own like flavor of neurodiversity, but like there are lists of things that are suggested as accommodations in different websites, and there are people who have gotten various forms of them at other universities. There's just no way to ask for that here, even if like or and some of those things cost money, but some of them don't. Like examples might be the ability, like preferential scheduling in terms of scheduling classes like back to back, or in terms of scheduling, or in terms of like time of day for meetings, or someone to help with administrative tasks that like I am good at lots of things, and some things like I am so slow at that it is a weird use of my time. And or even like a sharing thing, like I'll do this for you if you do this for me type of thing. So I think there's like ways to be creative, like the ability, like the College of Education is moving to a new building in a couple of years that's being built. And one of the concerns I have is that there's not enough space for all faculty to have their own private room. And I actually don't know if we need one for everyone. Like there's many reasons not to have that. But if I'm in a group space, I'm not going to get anything done. Like, no, it's just not going to happen. I'm going to be distracted all the time. And does that mean what does that mean, or what does that look like? Can the university like purchase some sort of blinders for me that, I mean, that there's many technology things that are like similar to that, right? That would help me get things done. Or like I don't know, there's I think there's ways to have those types of conversations, but they as far as I know, like our university is not having them. Maybe they're happening in other departments or other colleges, but from the sort of smaller accommodations that I tried to advocate for, that didn't happen. However, if you approach some of these not as accommodations, but as like productivity tools, other colleagues have gotten further. Isn't that weird? That's weird. So, yeah, I mean, lesson learned, I guess, but also like, I don't know, something maybe to reflect on as a university.
That
Or
that is
just one of
very
those things.
strange. That is very interesting.
Is it strange though?
Gotta learn how to play that game, I guess. Like, no, I don't need dividers for myself. I need it for an activity. And it's gonna go in my office. Yeah. Fair.
Yeah, it is the game though. It really is.
Yes,
And I think the
yes.
question that Joe brings up is like, really, should you have to? Right?
Yeah, right, right.
And I
So
am not great at like reading the room type games, you know? So then I'm like, okay, well, I have to advocate for myself professionally. And one of the things that I think came up in one of the circles like a while ago, I was sharing that I was like more recently diagnosed, and they're like, really? I'm like, yeah, I truly had no idea. And for better or worse, right? I think like, I don't know, no clue. So I was like plopped down in the middle of this game with like, how do we play this thing? And
Mm.
I'm good at figuring stuff out. Like I didn't get to where I am by not knowing how to figure things out. And it's hard because there's
Mm.
nothing like written. It's all learned experiences. And that's a really hard game to play if there's no rule book.
Yeah. Thank you guys all for sharing everything and your experiences and giving your guys input. I do want to give some time to everybody in the audience. I know we only have a few minutes left, but I do feel like it was so engaging. I had a hard time cutting people off. But if there's anyone in the from the audience that wants to ask some questions, you can type in the chat or you can unmute yourself. We do have a couple more minutes. Feel free to ask some questions.
I will ask a question if that's okay.
Sure.
Okay, so we only have like a few more minutes left. If you had to give one piece of advice, um, to maybe someone considering joining higher education, with a neurodiverse, mindset, like what, would you tell them?
I think there's so many reasons that we have enough people just in one college to have a circle. I think academia with it allows you to be really passionate about different things. And those deep dives can be part of your research, they can be part of your teaching. And there's also a lot of flexibility with academia, which we can all like, I mean, even not being neurodiverse, like there's good and bad things about that flexibility, but it does allow you to have more on and off days. It can also exacerbate them, but it also allows for some fluctuation in executive functions that I think allow me to thrive in this space. It also makes those same things can make it very difficult, but I don't know if that would be better or worse in like a different environment.
I think that's a good point, Joanna. Just the structure is very different um from other jobs, so it's something to be aware of and um depending on a person's strengths or differences, that might be something to consider. But I think it's important to get to know yourself and um, be confident about the things that you need. Personally, that's something I'm still learning about myself so that I can be a better advocate for myself and asking for what I need. So I need to figure that out. Um, so that's something that I would recommend to them also.
Yeah, I think I'd just like look in that one, both of you guys with just like, to me, it's about leaning in a little bit, leaning into kind of yourself. So if you're going to be in academia, you need to know yourself. You need to know how these things, how your kind of the neurodiversity or neurodivergence plays out in your life. Like, how does it play out? How does it affect other people? How do you want to talk about it? Do you want to talk about it? How do you want to, how much do you want to embrace it? So I think it's just kind of really knowing. That would be my advice, just to know yourself really well and think about how you're going to represent that in this particular environment.
And I think that is a nice place to end our speaker session. So thank you again to each of our panelists who came to share their personal experiences navigating the college with their disabilities. For our April, and thank you, Dr. Park, for putting it in the chat. But instead of our April speaker sessions, we are holding a free virtual symposium about global perspectives of disability engagement in the workplace. And you can find more information on our website, which is in the chat, and then you can register using that go.hawaii.edu shortened link. Also, before you go, I'm going to put in the chat a post survey for today's session. It really helps us when you guys fill all of this out, because then we can figure out how we can improve the next coming sessions or find out more things that people are interested in and kind of gear our sessions towards that. So again, thank you everyone for joining us today, and especially thank you to our panelists for being here. I will stick around if there's any other questions or people want to ask more questions. The panelists, if you want to stick around and see if anybody else have any questions, feel free to do so. If not, this does conclude our March monthly speaker session. Thank you everyone for coming. Bye.
Thank you. Thanks, Jarek. Thanks so much. Bye, guys.